A ruthless billionaire bought a virgin, but her boldness made him fall in love. Welcome to Alcot Stories, where love comes to life. At Alcot Stories, we bring you the most heartfelt, thrilling, and unforgettable love stories, filled with deep emotions, sizzling romance, and twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Every story is crafted to make you feel, dream, and believe in the power of love. Whether it's a billionaire falling for the woman who challenges him, or a romance that defies all odds, we promise stories that will touch your heart. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Comment below and let us know what kind of love story you want next. Your ideas inspire us. Join the Alcot Stories family, because love is the greatest story of all. The dimly lit auction hall buzzed with hushed voices, a hidden world where power reigned, and men like Damien Knight dictated fate. Sitting in the front row, clad in an immaculate black suit that matched the coldness in his eyes, Damien exuded dominance. The 30-year-old billionaire, feared and revered alike, had built his empire on control, and he never lost. Tonight was no different. As the auctioneer's voice echoed through the grand hall, Damien leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. He had seen countless deals made in his lifetime, hostile takeovers, crushed competitors, billion-dollar acquisitions. But tonight, the deal was personal. The doors at the back of the stage swung open, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Alina Carter walked in. She wasn't trembling like the others before her. No, she walked with her head high, her brown skin glowing under the chandelier lights, her dark curls cascading down her back like silk. Her hazel eyes burned with defiance, scanning the crowd with unhidden disgust. Damien sat up, intrigued. She was young, beautiful, untamed. The auctioneer cleared his throat. This rare beauty, Alina Carter, 18, untouched, sold to the highest bidder. Murmurs rippled through the audience, a mix of anticipation and desire. But before anyone could lift a paddle, Damien's deep, commanding voice cut through the silence. 10 million. A collective gasp filled the room. No one dared to challenge him. No one ever did. Sold to Mr. Knight. With a nod, Damien stood, adjusting the cuffs of his designer suit. The deal was done. Just another purchase. Just another possession, or so he thought. The first encounter. Alina was escorted to a luxurious black Rolls-Royce, her wrists no longer bound, but her spirit untouched. The moment the doors closed, silence settled between them like an unspoken challenge. Damien studied her. Her full lips were pressed into a firm line, her chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. She was supposed to be afraid. She wasn't. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was like honey, smooth but laced with steel. Damien smirked, tilting his head. "Why does it matter?" She turned to him, eyes locking onto his in a way that made his amusement falter. Most people couldn't meet his gaze for long. She held it with fire. "You think you own me?" she challenged, her voice unwavering. A dangerous silence followed. Damien leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I do." Alina didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned closer, her scent, a blend of jasmine and something he couldn't place, invading his senses. Then she whispered back, "No, Damien Knight." "You don't." The words were like a slap, sharp and unexpected. For the first time in his life, Damien Knight had just met someone who refused to submit. And strangely, it excited him. This wasn't going to be just another deal. This was war. The car ride to Damien's penthouse was thick with tension, the kind that crackled like a live wire. He had expected silence, fear, maybe even tears. Instead, Alina sat beside him, her arms folded, her gaze fixed out the window, unshaken. Damien wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to a woman who didn't cower, who didn't lower her eyes in submission, who didn't tremble under the weight of his presence, and it did something to him. It ignited something dark, something dangerous, something he didn't want to name. His gaze slid to her, taking in the soft curve of her jaw, the delicate slope of her nose, the fullness of her lips. Lips that had dared to tell him, "You don't own me." He clenched his jaw. She didn't know who she was dealing with, but she would, arriving at the penthouse. The Rolls-Royce pulled into the underground parking of Damien's towering penthouse, a glass fortress that loomed over the city. As the car came to a stop, Alina didn't wait for him. She opened the door and stepped out on her own. Damien's lips curled into a smirk. Defiant little thing. His personal assistant, Liam, rushed over, but one sharp look from Damien kept him quiet. Alina wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just a purchase. She was a challenge. And Damien Knight never backed down from a challenge. The first test. The elevator ride was silent, the tension pressing against the walls. Damien leaned against the mirrored surface, watching her through the reflection. She didn't even glance at him. That irritated him. "Are you always this stubborn?" he mused, his voice rich with amusement. Alina turned to face him, her hazel eyes fierce. "Are you always this arrogant?" His smirk deepened. "Arrogance comes with power." She crossed her arms. "And power means nothing if you don't have a soul." The doors slid open to his penthouse before he could respond, and she stepped out first, like she owned the place. Damien followed, watching her take in the sprawling living room, with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights glittering below, the sleek leather couches, the marble floors. It was luxury at its finest, and she looked completely unimpressed. He exhaled a slow, deliberate breath. She was different. He knew that from the moment she had locked eyes with him at the auction. But this was something else. Pushing her limits, Damien strode past her, loosening his tie as he poured himself a drink. He leaned against the bar, watching her. "Take off your coat." Alina didn't move. His brows lifted. "Didn't you hear me?" "I heard you," she said coolly. "Then do it." She tilted her head. "No." His grip on the glass tightened. No woman had ever told him no. He placed his drink down and approached her, slow, deliberate, predatory. "You like testing me, don't you?" His voice was dangerously soft. Alina met his gaze without hesitation. "And you like thinking you can control everyone?" Damien's smirk faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, she was getting under his skin. Before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away from him, the most powerful man in the room, the most powerful man in the city. Something inside him snapped. He had never wanted a woman this badly, but it wasn't just about possession anymore. It was about the fight. Alina Carter wasn't going to break easily, but that only made him more determined. The first sign of weakness. Later that night, Damien stood by the window of his bedroom, his jaw tight, his fingers curled around a tumbler of whiskey. He had meant to dominate her, to make her realize who was in control. Instead, she had left him standing there, watching as she disappeared into the guest bedroom without another word. And for the first time in his life, Damien Knight felt something unfamiliar, something he had never felt before. He was losing control, and he didn't know if he liked I. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain, as Damien Knight stood at the edge of his private rooftop terrace, overlooking the glittering skyline. A single table was set in the middle, adorned with flickering candles and red wine. He never put this much effort into a dinner. Why was tonight different? His jaw clenched as he turned toward the woman who had been haunting his thoughts since the moment she challenged him. Alina Carter. She walked onto the rooftop with effortless grace, her brown skin glowing under the soft candlelight, her dark curls tumbling down her back. She wore a sleek, midnight blue dress that hugged her curves, the slit on the side revealing just enough to be dangerous. Damien had chosen it for her. He expected her to resist, to refuse, but instead she wore it like she owned the moment, like she owned him, and that thought alone unsettled him. The game begins. Damien pulled out a chair, a rare gesture of politeness. Alina didn't thank him. Instead, she sat down with a slight smirk, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "You think this will impress me?" she asked, swirling the wine in her glass. His lips curled. "Everything impresses people when they have nothing." She arched a brow. "Is that what you think of me? That I have nothing?" Damien leaned back, studying her. "Don't you?" Alina took a slow sip of wine before setting the glass down. She leaned forward, her voice softer but cutting. "You have billions, power, and people who bend at your feet, and yet you sit here across from me, trying to prove something. Maybe you're the one with nothing." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. She was playing with fire, and for the first time, he liked it. Melting the ice. The dinner went on like a battle, sharp words, teasing glances, a dance of power and restraint. Every time he tried to dominate the conversation, she turned the tables, challenging his beliefs on power, love, and control. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth. She wasn't awed by his power. She saw right through him. As the night deepened, Damien watched the way she spoke, how her lips moved, the way her fingers trailed over the rim of her wineglass. He wanted to touch her, to own her, but something in her eyes told him he never would. The breaking point. When dessert arrived, Alina pushed the plate aside, crossing her arms. "You know what your problem is, Damien," she mused, tilting her head. He smirked. "Do tell." "You don't know what it's like to not get what you want." His jaw flexed. "And you think you're the exception?" She leaned closer, the candlelight dancing in her eyes. "I know I am." Silence. Thick, suffocating tension settled between them. And then it happened. Damien's restraint snapped. His hand moved before he could stop himself, fingers grazing her jaw, tilting her chin up. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. She dared him, and Damien Knight never backed down from a challenge. The kiss, both war and surrender. He crushed his lips against hers, the fire between them exploding. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was war, a clash of dominance, a battle for control. But then something shifted. Alina responded, not with submission, but with equal fire. Her hands gripped his suit, pulling him closer. Her lips parted, letting him deepen the kiss, their breaths tangling, their bodies pressed together. For the first time, Damien felt out of control, and he didn't know if he wanted it back. The aftermath. When he pulled away, both of them were breathless. Alina's lips were swollen, her chest rising and falling as she whispered, "I told you, you don't own me." Damien's thumb traced her lower lip, his voice dangerously low. "No, Alina, but I will." She smirked. "We'll see." And just like that she walked away, leaving Damien sitting there, his heart pounding, his world tilting. For the first time a woman had left him wanting more, and that was dangerous. The private jet hummed softly as it cut through the night sky, heading toward their destination. Damien sat with his usual air of control, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze flickering to the woman who was unraveling him one challenge at a time, Alina Carter. She sat across from him, legs crossed, lips curled into the smallest, most infuriating smirk. She knew what she was doing to him, and he hated it. No, he craved it. The memory of their candlelit kiss from the night before still lingered on his lips, burned into his mind. He hadn't meant to lose control. He hadn't meant to let her get under his skin. But she had. And now, as the jet landed and the two of them were escorted to the luxurious hotel Damien had chosen, he made one thing very clear. One suite. His assistant, Liam, hesitated. "Sir, I can book a second." Damien's tone was sharp. "One suite. If Alina wanted to play with fire, he would make sure she burned first." The hotel suite. Another battle begins. The penthouse suite was nothing short of breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, while a king-sized bed dominated the center of the room. Alina strolled in casually, glancing around as if evaluating his choice. "I assume you'll be sleeping on the couch," she teased, her hazel eyes twinkling with mischief. Damien smirked, loosening his tie. "You assume wrong." Her lips parted slightly as if surprised, but then that damn smirk returned. "Good, because I don't like couches either." And before he could process what she was doing, she walked straight to the bed and lay down, stretching her body across the plush sheets like she belonged there, like she belonged to him. Damien's body tensed. She was testing him again, and he was dangerously close to failing. A slow-burning storm. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders as he unbuttoned the top of his dress shirt. "You enjoy pushing me, don't you?" he murmured, stepping toward the bed. Alina tilted her head, her dark curls spilling over the pillows. "I enjoy proving that you're not as in control as you think you are." His jaw clenched. She was right. Damn it. She was right. He had spent years mastering control, over his empire, over his emotions, over every person in his life. But her? She was slipping past every wall, cracking every layer of ice, and the worst part, he didn't want to stop her. The moment, he gives in. Damien sat at the edge of the bed, his fingers brushing the silk sheets beside her. Her scent surrounded him, warm, intoxicating, dangerous. "You don't know what you're playing with, Alina," he warned, his voice low. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the hint of stubble. "And you don't know what it feels like to lose control, do you?" He gritted his teeth. "I don't lose." Alina's gaze dropped to his lips, then lifted back to his eyes. "Then prove it. Don't touch me." A sharp breath left his lungs. It was a dare, a challenge he should have walked away from. But then she shifted, her dress slipping slightly off one shoulder, exposing smooth golden skin. His hand moved on instinct, brushing over her collarbone, tracing the heat of her skin. Alina's breath hitched, but she didn't move away. Neither did he, and suddenly his patience snapped. His mouth crashed onto hers, but this kiss wasn't like the first. This wasn't war. This was surrender. It was slow, deep, consuming. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, pressing her body against his. The fire between them built, slowly, dangerously, deliberately. Damien's fingers skimmed the curve of her waist, his touch rough yet reverent. She had shattered his control, and he wasn't sure he wanted it back. A night that changes everything. Hours later, the room was dark, silent, filled with the remnants of their storm. Damien lay awake, watching her, her body curled against his, her breath soft and steady, her presence both intoxicating and terrifying. This was supposed to be a game, a challenge. But somewhere along the way, he had started losing himself. He had started wanting more. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over New York's elite. Women draped in diamonds and men in tailored suits moved like chess pieces, their laughter blending with the soft melody of a string quartet. Damien Knight never cared for these events. They were nothing more than power plays, businessmen flaunting their influence, women throwing themselves at him, hoping to be his next indulgence. But tonight was different, because somewhere in this crowd was her. And for the first time in his life, Damien felt something close to anticipation. A vision in red. Then he saw her, and the air left his lungs. Alina Carter, draped in a red silk gown that hugged her curves, the fabric cascading around her like liquid fire. The dress left her shoulders bare, exposing her smooth, golden-brown skin, a contrast that sent heat surging through Damien's veins. Her mask, a delicate lace design, framed her hazel eyes, making them all the more dangerous. Every man in the room noticed her, every man wanted her, and Damien felt something dark, something possessive, coiled deep in his chest. She was his, even if she didn't know it yet. The dance begins. As if sensing his gaze, Alina turned. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, the energy between them crackling like a live wire. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, a slow, teasing smile that made his fingers twitch at his sides. And then she walked away. Damien's jaw tightened. She was playing with him, testing his patience. Fine. If it was a game she wanted, he'd play. The chase Damien moved through the crowd with lethal grace, weaving between laughing guests and swirling gowns, his eyes never leaving her. He reached her just as a man, some young, arrogant heir, extended his hand for a dance. Before Alina could accept, Damien was there. "Not tonight," he murmured, his hand sliding around her waist, claiming her in front of everyone. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let him lead her onto the dance floor. The moment he touched her, the world disappeared. Like they were meant to be. The orchestra shifted into a slow, sensual waltz. Damien's hand pressed against the small of Alina's back, pulling her flush against him. Their bodies fit like a perfect puzzle, like they had danced this dance 1,000 times before. Her scent, jasmine and something undeniably her, wrapped around him, making his pulse thunder. His fingers brushed against her exposed spine, feeling the way her breath hitched. She wasn't unaffected. Good. Neither was he. Was this your plan?" he murmured against her ear. "To make every man in this room want you?" Alina tilted her head, her lips inches from his. "Why? Are you jealous?" His grip on her waist tightened. "I don't get jealous." She smiled. "Then why are you holding me so tight?" Damien exhaled sharply. She was dangerous, a temptation he never saw coming, and worse, he didn't want to resist. The world fades away. The music swelled and they moved together like a whispered secret, a dance of tension and fire. Damien didn't just lead. Alina challenged him, meeting every step, matching his intensity. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't intimidated. She belonged here, in his arms. And in that moment, Damien Knight, the ruthless billionaire who never lost control, felt something shift. Alina Carter was no longer just a possession, no longer just a challenge. She was an obsession, the moment that changed everything. As the final note of the waltz played, Damien spun Alina one last time, pulling her back into his arms. Their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling. The room was still spinning, people whispering, watching. But none of it mattered, because all he could see was her. And then he did something reckless. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't soft, it was raw, hungry, filled with every unspoken desire he had tried to bury. Alina gasped against his lips, but didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him back just as fiercely, just as desperately, right there, in the middle of a ballroom full of people. For the first time, Damien didn't care about power, about control, about winning. All he cared about was her. And that scared him more than anything ever had. The morning after the masquerade ball, Damien Knight sat in his penthouse office, staring at nothing. The taste of Alina's lips still lingered on his, the way she had melted into his arms, the way she had kissed him like she felt it too. It haunted him, but she hadn't just been another conquest. She was different, and that terrified him. The warning. He can't love. Alina Carter wasn't blind. She knew the kind of man Damien was. Ruthless, powerful, dangerous. But what scared her wasn't his darkness. It was the way he made her crave it. She had spent the entire day trying to shake the feeling of last night. The way he had held her, the way his kiss had made her feel like she belonged to him. But before she could even make sense of it, Vivian Grant walked into her life. Damien's ex. Vivian was the kind of woman who belonged in his world. Tall, blonde, ice-cold perfection. She found Alina at the hotel bar, sitting beside her like an old friend. "You're beautiful," Vivian said, sipping her martini. "That's why he wants you." Alina's stomach twisted. "And why are you telling me this?" Vivian smirked. "Because I've been where you are, thinking I was special, thinking he cared." She leaned in, her voice like poison. "But let me save you the heartbreak, darling. Damien Knight doesn't love. He only destroys." Alina swallowed hard. She wanted to ignore the warning, but deep down, a whisper of doubt had already taken root. The deal that shattered everything. That night, Alina couldn't sleep. Vivian's words echoed in her mind, and the way Damien looked at her at the masquerade, the raw, possessive intensity in his gaze. It terrified her. She needed air. Slipping out of bed, she wandered toward the balcony of the penthouse suite. But just as she passed the study, she heard something that made her freeze. Damien's voice, cold, unforgiving, ruthless. "I don't care how you get it done. Just make sure they're out of the way." Alina's blood turned to ice. A second voice, someone over the phone, responded, "That family will lose everything, Mr. Knight." "Not my problem," Damien said flatly. "I don't lose." Alina's hands shook as she covered her mouth. What was he doing? Whose life was he about to ruin? Vivian's words came rushing back. "He doesn't love, he only destroys." And she had almost believed she was different. The accusation. "You're a monster." Alina stormed into the room, her heart pounding. "Who are you destroying tonight, Damien?" she spat, her voice trembling with anger. Damien's head snapped up. His phone was still in his hand, but his expression had already darkened. "Alina." His tone was sharp. A warning. But she didn't care. "I heard everything," she continued. "You don't care about anyone, do you? You just destroy lives because it's convenient." His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dangerous. "Be careful, Alina," he said quietly, but she didn't stop. "You don't feel anything, do you? You just use people and throw them away." Something flickered across his face, a crack in his armor, but it was gone in a second. "I never pretended to be a good man," he said. Alina's chest ached, but she refused to let him see it. "You're right," she whispered. "You're not a good man. You're a monster." The words sliced through the air, and for the first time Damien Knight felt something close to pain. The decision, walking away. Alina turned on her heels and stormed to the bedroom, throwing her clothes into a suitcase. She had to leave. Now she heard Damien enter the room behind her, his voice low and controlled. "What do you think you're doing?" She didn't stop packing. "I'm leaving." A heavy silence, then a dangerous laugh. "You think you can just walk away?" Damien's voice was softer now, but it was laced with something dark. Alina spun around, fire in her eyes. "Watch me." For the first time in his life, Damien Knight felt helpless. She was leaving him. And that was something he didn't know how to stop. The moment that broke him, Alina pushed past him, dragging her suitcase to the door. But before she could reach it, Damien grabbed her wrist. It wasn't rough, it wasn't forceful, it was desperate. "Don't do this," he said, his voice strained. She'd never heard him sound like that before, like he was afraid. Alina swallowed the lump in her throat. "Why shouldn't I?" Damien's grip loosened. For the first time, he had no answer. Because if he told her the truth, that he needed her, that she was the only thing keeping him from falling into darkness, he would be giving her a power over him that no one had ever had. And Damien Knight did not surrender power. So instead, he let her go. And for the first time in his life, he lost Alina Carter had walked away from Damien Knight, or at least she tried to. Her heart had been pounding when she stepped out of his penthouse, dragging her suitcase behind her. The city air was sharp against her skin, her mind still reeling from the way Damien had looked at her, like he was breaking, but too damn stubborn to stop her. But none of it mattered anymore. She needed to get away. She needed to be free. What she didn't know was that freedom wouldn't come easy, and in just a few hours, she'd be fighting for her life. The kidnapping, taken in the dark. The black SUV pulled up too fast. Alina barely had time to react before a rough hand grabbed her, yanking her off her feet. She screamed, struggling against the iron grip, but a cloth pressed against her face. Chloroform. Her world blurred. Then everything went black. The enemy's lair. Alina woke up to cold metal chains against her wrists. Her head pounded, her vision blurry. She was in a dark warehouse, the air thick with the scent of oil and blood. The dim light flickered, revealing 3 men. One sat in a chair, completely relaxed, Vincent Romano. A name she had heard whispered in the elite circles of New York. A man just as powerful as Damien, but twice as cruel. The other 2? Hired muscle. Vincent smirked when he saw her stir. "Ah, Sleeping Beauty is awake!" Alina swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "If this is about money, you've kidnapped the wrong woman," he laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't about you. It's about Damien Knight." Her stomach twisted. Of course, this had nothing to do with her. She was just a pawn in a war she didn't even understand. Vincent leaned forward. "You were his latest pet, weren't you?" Alina clenched her jaw. "Don't react. Don't give him anything." "I'm nothing to him," she said flatly. Vincent's smirk widened. "Then you won't mind betraying him." The test: betray Damien or suffer. Alina's pulse hammered. Vincent pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. "We've been waiting to take Damien down for years, but he's always one step ahead. Annoying, really." He sighed dramatically before turning to her. "But you're different." Alina glared at him. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vincent's eyes gleamed. "Oh, I think you do. Damien let you in. He let you close, which means you know something." He slid a knife across the table. Alina stiffened. "You have 2 choices," Vincent said, his voice smooth. "Tell me what you know about Damien's dealings, his weak spots, his plans, his secrets, or you suffer." Her hands shook against the chains. This was it. The moment she could ruin Damien. The man who had bought her, controlled her, broken her heart. But even as the memories of their fights flashed in her mind, so did the moments of tenderness. The way he had looked at her during the masquerade. The way he had held her like she was his world. The way he had let her go, even when it destroyed him. And suddenly, she knew. She might hate him, but she would never betray him. The torture begins. Alina lifted her chin. "Go to hell." Vincent sighed, shaking his head. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." He snapped his fingers. The first punch landed hard. Pain exploded across her ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. She gasped, her body screaming in protest. Still, she didn't speak. Another hit, harder this time. She bit her lip, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. Vincent knelt beside her, gripping her chin. "Still want to play the hero?" Alina's vision blurred, but she smiled through the pain. "Damien is going to kill you." Vincent chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, he doesn't even know you're gone." Alina's heart clenched. Would Damien come for her? Did he even care? She didn't know. But if she was going to die tonight, at least she wouldn't die a traitor. Damien's breaking point. Where the hell is she? Damien Knight had been drinking whiskey in his office when the call came. "Boss, we have a problem." Leo, his head of security, never called him unless it was serious. Damien frowned. "What kind of problem?" A pause, then, "It's Alina. She's been taken." The glass shattered in Damien's grip. His heart stopped. Alina. Gone. For the first time in his life, Damien felt true, soul-crushing fear. And just like that, his world burned. The rescue, Damien's wrath. The warehouse doors exploded inward. Gunshots rang through the air as Damien and his men stormed in, weapons blazing. Vincent barely had time to react before Damien's fist connected with his face, sending him crashing to the floor. Blood dripped from Damien's knuckles as he stood over him, his eyes cold, deadly. "You took something that belongs to me," Damien said, his voice eerily calm. Vincent spat blood. "She's just a woman, Knight. You can replace her." That was the last mistake Vincent ever made. Damien pulled out his gun, pressing it against Vincent's forehead. "Say that again." Vincent paled. "Boss," Leo interrupted, "we got Alina." Damien turned, and there she was, bruised, beaten, but still standing. Their eyes met. Something inside Damien snapped. He rushed to her, his hands gentle but desperate as he cupped her face. "Alina," she exhaled shakily. "Took you long enough." Damien's jaw clenched. "I'm going to kill them all." Alina's lips curved into a weak smile. "Already handled." His heart clenched. Even after everything, she hadn't betrayed him. And just like that, Damien Knight knew he could never let her go again. The night was cold, but Damien Knight was burning. His hands were still stained with Vincent Romano's blood, his pulse a chaotic storm in his veins. But none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the woman in his arms. Alina. Bruised, battered, but still alive. His grip tightened around her as if he could keep her from vanishing. His breath was uneven, his heart a mess. Damien Knight never lost control. Until now. Until her. Tearing the city apart. Damien's wrath. The moment Damien found out Alina was missing, the city had turned into a war zone. Every nightclub, every underground meeting place, every single one of his rivals' hideouts, he had destroyed them all. His men had never seen him like this. Cold, unhinged, deadly. The fear in Leo's voice had been unmistakable when he tried to calm him. "Boss, we're doing everything we can." Damien had gritted his teeth, his grip white-knuckled around his whiskey glass. Not enough. He had personally interrogated everyone. He had broken bones, shattered alliances, threatened men who once considered themselves untouchable. Nothing had mattered, not money, not power, not even his own damn life. Only Alina. The rescue. Damien's rage and relief. The moment Damien had stormed into the warehouse, everything else had blurred. Vincent's men had barely lasted 2 minutes before they were dead or begging for mercy, and then he had seen her, chained, bruised, stubborn as hell. Something inside him had shattered. He had crossed the room in seconds, his hands shaking as he freed her. "Alina," he had breathed, his voice rough, her lashes fluttered open. Even after everything, she managed a small smirk. "Took you long enough?" Damien let out a sharp breath, cupping her face. "You're insane!" Her lips parted in surprise. "What? You were willing to die for me?" His voice broke. For the first time in his life, Damien Knight felt unworthy. A man unworthy of love. They were in the car now, speeding away from the battlefield. Aline's head rested on his shoulder, exhaustion weighing on her, but Damien couldn't let go of her hand. She had been willing to endure torture, to suffer, to risk everything. For him, a man who had bought her, a man who had controlled her, a man who had never deserved her. He should have been relieved. He had won. But instead his chest ached. Damien had never known what guilt felt like. Until now. The moment. He almost let her go back at his penthouse. The doctor had patched up Alina's wounds. She had been so damn strong. She didn't cry, didn't complain. But he saw it. The way her fingers trembled. The way her body ached. The way she flinched when someone touched her. Because of him, because she had been taken as a weapon against him. Damien stood by the window, gripping the edge of the marble counter. Leo's voice echoed behind him. "Boss, what now? What now?" Damien exhaled, his jaw tightening. He knew what he had to do. Let her go. It was the only way to keep her safe. She deserved better, a normal life, a life without him. His chest tightened, but he ignored it. He was Damien Knight. He didn't break. He didn't love. And yet, when he turned back to look at her, he knew it was already too late. He couldn't let her go, even if it destroyed them both. The city lights shimmered outside the penthouse windows, casting shadows across the dark room. But inside, the storm brewing between Damien and Alina was far more dangerous than the night. Alina sat on the edge of the couch, arms crossed, her brown skin still bruised from the nightmare she had survived. Yet her eyes were filled with fire. Damien stood near the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His perfectly tailored black shirt was still unbuttoned at the top, his jaw clenched so tight it could shatter. They had been silent for too long. Finally, Alina spoke. "Do you even have a heart, Damien?" Her voice was low, but it sliced through him like a blade. Damien flinched. No one had ever dared to ask him that. No one had ever cared enough to. He turned, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "What do you think?" he asked, voice cold. Alina stood up, stepping closer, her gaze searching his. "I think you hide behind power and money because you're afraid of feeling." Damien laughed bitterly. "Feeling is a weakness." Alina didn't back down. "Then why did you tear the city apart to find me?" His breath hitched. She was too close, too damn close. Her presence was suffocating, intoxicating. He wanted to push her away, to bury the emotions clawing at his chest. But Alina wasn't done. "You say you don't feel, but I saw the way you looked at me when I was hurt." She took another step. "I saw the way you held me, the way you nearly broke when you thought you might lose me." Damien's fingers curled into fists. She was right, and that scared the hell out of him. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand." Alina's voice softened. "Then make me understand." A long silence stretched between them. Damien clenched his jaw. He never talked about the past, never. But with Alina, he couldn't stop himself. The past that made him ruthless. Damien took a slow breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "My mother was a maid," he said. Alina blinked. That was unexpected. "She worked for a powerful man, my father." His lips curled into a bitter smirk. But to him, she was nothing more than a disposable toy. Alina's heart clenched. "She got pregnant with me. He paid her to disappear." Damien's jaw tightened. "She raised me alone. Worked herself to death to make sure I never went hungry. His hands trembled slightly, but he shoved them deeper into his pockets. When I was 10, she got sick, needed surgery. I begged my father for help. He let out a sharp breath. You know what he did? Alina swallowed. What? Damien's blue eyes turned ice cold. He laughed, told me people like us didn't deserve to live. Alina gasped. Damien's smirk was cruel, but his eyes held pain. She died a week later. A silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Alina's heart ached. I learned my lesson that day, Damien continued. Money is power. Love is weakness. Alina's eyes burned. That's not true. Damien let out a bitter chuckle. Isn't it? I built an empire so no one could ever hurt me again. And now, he turned to her, his voice sharp, you make me feel, and I hate it. Seeing the broken boy beneath the billionaire Alina's throat tightened. For the first time, she didn't see the ruthless billionaire. She saw the broken boy, the one who had begged for his mother's life, the one who had been abandoned, the one who had built walls so high no one could ever reach him, until now, until her. She stepped forward and did something Damien never expected. She reached out and touched his face. Damien went still. Alina's fingers were gentle, warm. I'm sorry, she whispered. Damien closed his eyes. No one had ever said that to him before, and when he opened them, there was something raw in his gaze, something dangerous, because for the first time in his life, Damien Knight wanted to believe in love. But could he, or would he destroy them both? The penthouse was silent, too silent, yet the storm between Damien and Alina was deafening. She stood near the door, her suitcase beside her. Her choice was made. Damien stood a few feet away, hands clenched at his sides, his expression carved from ice. But his blue eyes, they weren't cold. They were a battlefield of emotions he refused to name, and Alina couldn't stay to watch him lose the war. She took a deep breath. I love you, Damien. The words hung between them like a dagger, sharp and unyielding. Damien's body tensed, his lips parting slightly, but he said nothing, because he didn't believe in love. And that was why she had to go. Her heart ached, but she forced herself to pick up her suitcase. I can't be with someone who doesn't believe in love, she whispered. Damien's chest tightened. His worst fear was coming true. She was leaving, and he had no idea how to stop her. Damien's silence, his greatest mistake. Say something, Alina pleaded. Anything. Damien's throat burned. He wanted to, but what could he say? That he didn't want her to go, that he needed her, that he felt something terrifying every time she looked at him. Damien Knight didn't beg, didn't love. So instead, he said the worst thing possible. You'll regret this. Alina's breath hitched. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had given him a chance, one last chance, and he had thrown it away. She lifted her chin. No, Damien, you will. And with that, she walked out the door. Damien watches her go. The moment, he breaks. Damien didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't chase her. The elevator dinged. The doors shut. She was gone. His heart pounded violently in his chest, but he ignored it. He had survived worse. This was nothing. But when he turned toward the window and saw her getting into a cab, his world cracked. His fingers twitched at his sides. Go after her. Stop her. Say something. But he just stood there, like a fool, like a man who had just lost the only thing that ever mattered. His jaw clenched, his nails digging into his palms. This was what he had wanted, right? To keep his heart locked away, to make sure no one could ever hurt him, to prove that love was a lie. Then why did it feel like he was bleeding inside? Why did it feel like he couldn't breathe? The empty penthouse, a life without her hours passed. Maybe days. Damien didn't know. His penthouse felt colder, the air heavier. Everything was the same. Except nothing was. Her scent was still on the pillows, her laughter still echoed in the hallways, her warmth still lingered on his skin. But she wasn't there. And for the first time in his life, Damien Knight felt empty. He had built an empire, destroyed enemies, controlled everything around him. But he had lost her, and no amount of money could bring her back. His chest ached, his head spun, and suddenly he realized the most terrifying truth of all. He couldn't live without her. But was it too late? Weeks. Without him, Alina sat by her apartment window staring at the city skyline, but her heart was nowhere near the present. It had been weeks since she left Damien Knight. Weeks of trying to forget him. Weeks of convincing herself she had made the right choice. Weeks of waiting for a pain that never faded. She had told herself Damien wasn't capable of love, that he would move on, untouched, unshaken. Yet, every night, she dreamt of his voice, his touch, his blue eyes dark with emotions he refused to name. She missed him. But missing someone who didn't love you was pointless. So why did it still hurt? A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Delivery for Miss Carter," the courier said. Alina blinked, confused. She hadn't ordered anything. When she took the envelope, her heart stopped. It was from him, Damien. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. There was no money, no gifts, no grand gestures, just words, his words. And that was far more dangerous. The letter that changed everything. "Alina, you once asked me if I have a heart. I do. It's yours. I don't know how to love. I never have. My entire life, love was a weakness, a lie people told themselves to feel less alone. Then you came along. And suddenly I was terrified. I let you walk away because I thought I was protecting you, because I thought I wasn't capable of giving you what you deserve. But I was wrong. Every second without you feels like drowning. Every breath without you feels empty. I don't care about power or control or anything else. I care about you. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I deserve to. But if there's any part of you that still believes in me, tell me. And if you don't, I'll let you go. For real this time." Damien, Alina's tears, and her realization. Alina clutched the letter to her chest, her vision blurred with tears. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a demand. This was his heart, laid bare, raw, unguarded. Damien Knight, the ruthless billionaire, had finally let down his walls. For her, her fingers traced his words. "If there's any part of you that still believes in me, tell me." Her heart pounded. Because she did. She still loved him. But was love enough? Could she risk everything for a man who had only just learned how to love? Her hands trembled. She had to decide, because if she didn't, she might lose him forever. A decision that changed everything. Alina sat with Damien's letter in her hands, her heart in chaos. She had spent weeks convincing herself that leaving was the right choice, that Damien Knight was incapable of love. But this letter, it was different. It wasn't cold. It wasn't calculated. It was real, raw, vulnerable. She read his final words again. "If there's any part of you that still believes in me, tell me." And deep down she did. But was love enough? Could he really change? Or would she end up heartbroken all over again? Before she could decide, her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Her stomach tightened. Something felt off. She answered. "Hello?" A low, sharp voice cut through the silence. "You need to come to Damien Knight's estate. Now." Alina's heart stopped. Why? What happened? The voice hesitated, because he just burned his entire empire to the ground. For you. Damien's ultimate sacrifice. The moment Alina arrived at Damien's estate, she knew something was different. There were no bodyguards, no security. The once intimidating mansion felt empty. As she stepped inside, her breath hitched. Damien stood in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by stacks of shredded contracts, burned legal documents, and destroyed business records. She gasped. "Damien, what did you do?" He turned to her, his blue eyes dark with exhaustion, but also relief. "I let it go," he said simply. Alina's hands trembled. "What do you mean?" "I destroyed everything that made me the man you walked away from." He took a step closer. "Everything that hurt you. Everything that made me a monster." Alina shook her head, overwhelmed. "Your empire was built on control and power, and neither of those things matter without you." His voice was raw. "I don't want power, Alina. I want you." Her chest ached. "You once told me I was afraid of feeling," he continued. "You were right, but I'm not afraid anymore." He took another step, closing the space between them. His hands trembled as he reached for her face. "I love you." Alina's breath caught. She had waited so long to hear those words from him, but this time she didn't just hear them. She believed them. The man who changed for love. Alina searched his face. This wasn't the same Damien Knight she had walked away from. This wasn't the ruthless billionaire who thought love was weakness. This was a man who had torn his entire world apart just to prove he could be better. For her heart shattered, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that she had never stopped loving him. Tears filled her eyes. She reached for him, and then she kissed him. It wasn't just passion, it was forgiveness, it was love, it was a promise. As their lips met, Damien pulled her closer, holding onto her like she was his entire world, because she was, and this time he wouldn't lose her, not ever again. The man who was once a king. Damien Knight, the ruthless billionaire who once commanded cities with his wealth and influence, stood before Alina with no walls between them. His once imposing presence was now replaced with something entirely different. He was no longer the man who demanded power, no longer the cold, untouchable ruler who believed love was a weakness. He was just a man, standing before the woman who had made him realize that love is the only power worth having. Alina's heart raced as she saw him, not as the dangerous businessman he used to be, but as the man he had become, the man who had chosen her over everything. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no signs of control, only the vulnerability of a man who had lost everything and was now fighting for the one thing he couldn't live without: her. The second chance he deserved. Damien stepped closer to Alina, his steps slow and purposeful. His voice was a whisper, hoarse with emotion. "Alina," he began, his blue eyes searching hers with a depth she had never seen before. "I know I don't deserve a second chance." Alina's chest tightened, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to reach for him, to close the distance between them, but something in her held her back. "I've hurt you." Damien's voice cracked. "I pushed you away when all you ever wanted was to love me." Tears welled up in Alina's eyes. She had never seen him this vulnerable before. The man who had once crushed hearts now stood before her, laying his soul bare. "Damien," she whispered, "I love you." His breath hitched. "Then why did you leave me?" She closed her eyes, the memory of her departure flashing before her. The pain of walking away, believing that love was something he could never give her. But now, standing in front of him, she saw it. He had changed. I didn't believe you could change, she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was wrong. Damien reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as he brushed them against her skin. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Give me a chance to prove to you that I am worthy of your love. The power of love over all. Alina's heart hammered in her chest. Could she really do this? Could she give this man, who had broken her heart and rebuilt her trust, a second chance? She looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw honesty. No games, no masks, just the raw, painful truth of a man who had once believed in nothing but power, now realizing that love was the one thing he couldn't live without. Damien Knight had spent his life building empires, manipulating, controlling, and winning. But in the end, none of it mattered, because none of it was real. The only real thing, the only thing worth fighting for, was her. Alina's tears fell freely now as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I never wanted to leave you, she whispered, but I didn't believe you could love me, not the way I needed. Damien cupped her face gently, his touch soft but firm. I do love you, he said, his voice a vow. I will always love you. Please let me prove it. Without another word, Alina nodded. And then she kissed him, gently at first, but with a passion that spoke louder than any words. Love had won. They had both fought for it, but in the end, it was love that conquered all. The future. They could build together. When they pulled apart, their foreheads resting against each other, Damien whispered, I will never stop fighting for you. Alina smiled softly, tears still glistening in her eyes. You don't have to fight anymore. And as they stood there together in that moment, they both knew that their love had overcome the greatest battle. No power, no empire, no money, just two people united by love. And that was enough. The wedding that changed everything. The sound of crashing waves filled the air as golden sunlight bathed the beach in warmth. The sky stretched endlessly above, painted in hues of soft pink and orange, as if nature itself was celebrating this moment. Alina stood at the aisle's entrance, barefoot on the soft sand, her heart pounding as she looked ahead. At him, Damien Knight, the man who once believed love was a weakness. The man who had once tried to own her, only to end up belonging to her instead. He stood there, waiting for her at the altar, dressed in a white linen suit, his usually cold blue eyes now filled with something he had once been terrified of. Love. She took a deep breath. This was it, the moment they had fought for, the moment that proved love was stronger than power, stronger than fear, stronger than any walls that had ever been built between them. With every step toward him, memories flashed in her mind. Their first meeting, their battles, their passionate nights, their painful goodbyes, and now their forever. She reached him, her brown eyes locking onto his. Damien exhaled sharply, as if seeing her in that wedding dress took the very breath from his lungs. You are... His voice was hoarse. The most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Alina's heart swelled. This was the same man who once thought love was meaningless. Now, he was completely hers. Vows that meant everything. The officiant smiled at them both. You may now exchange your vows. Damien took a steadying breath before reaching for Alina's hands. His grip was firm, his fingers slightly trembling. Alina, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I once thought power was everything, that control was the only way to survive. And then you came into my life and proved me wrong. Alina's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I fought you? Damien admitted, a small, self-deprecating smile on his lips. "I fought your love, your strength, your fire. I tried to push you away, but the truth is—" He exhaled shakily. "I was always yours." A tear slipped down Alina's cheek. Damien gently wiped it away before continuing. "I love you, Alina Carter, and I promise that from this day forward, I will never stop choosing you. Not as the man I used to be, but as the man you helped me become." The guests sighed in admiration. Alina took a deep breath and squeezed his hands. "Damien," she whispered, her voice shaking with love, "you were the most frustrating, impossible, arrogant man I had ever met." The crowd chuckled, and even Damien smirked. "But beneath all of that, you were also the man who needed love the most." Damien's smirk faded, replaced by raw emotion. "I love you," she said, "not because you changed, but because you chose to be better, for yourself, for us. And I promise that I will love you, through every storm, through every challenge, through every moment of this beautiful, imperfect life we will share." Tears welled in Damien's eyes. He had never been one to show vulnerability, but in this moment, he didn't care. She was his everything, and he was hers. Happily ever after, but not the fairy tale kind. "You may now kiss the bride." Damien wasted no time. He cradled her face and kissed her like he had waited a lifetime for this moment. Because he had. The guests erupted into cheers, rose petals rained around them, and the ocean waves crashed in celebration. As they pulled apart, forehead to forehead, Alina whispered, "So, Mr. Knight, how does it feel to finally lose?" Damien chuckled, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "If loving you is losing, then I never want to win again." The message that mattered. Their love story wasn't perfect. It was messy, painful, full of mistakes, but in the end, it proved something powerful. Power means nothing if you don't have love, because no amount of money, control, or influence could ever replace the feeling of belonging to someone who truly saw you. Damien had spent his life conquering the world, but the only thing that had ever truly mattered was her heart, and now it was his, forever.